And then I met the National Audit Office and I said to him, I'm afraid you've got a bit of competition. 800 brains down in Buckingham Palace Road who I have the pleasure of working with. I think he's admitted defeat on that one. But I'm the Labour and Co-op MP for Hackney, South and Shoreditch, as Michael said. I've been doing that for 14 years. But before that, I was on the London government when it was recreated. So it seems extraordinary to remember this, but it was actually, we had a London government that was abolished in 1987, it was recreated in 2000. And before that, I was a councillor for 8 years in a London borough. And at the age of 26, found myself in charge of a £300 million budget for housing and social services, and dealing with lots of meetings with members of the public. And I think that's why I've raised that, is two things. One, I've dealt with scrutiny both as a councillor and as a member of the London Assembly before I came to Parliament. So scrutiny's been part of my DNA for a long time. But also because I think it's important to remember what politicians bring to the picture, that we meet people face to face all the time. I'm in their living rooms, on their doorsteps, week in, week out. I have my regular surgeries, which actually the NEO staff sometimes come and sit in on, so that auditors can see very directly from a politician's view what we see. So we have very direct impact with how policy is working on the ground. In fact, I've started a campaign, you might want to take back to your countries, to get civil servants to come. So we have a number of Treasury civil servants coming in. I'd say some of them are so young, I introduce them on work experience. I get away with that. But it's a great way, they find it very revealing, because I think it's a very big distance, my serious point really is, there's a very big distance from what we would say is Whitehall, from the central departments of government, to the actual reality of the delivery of our policy on the ground. And one of the benefits of national audit bodies is they do help to bridge that gap, and do so very, very effectively. But as a British parliamentarian, I came to you from an institution which is falling to bits, not a metaphor. The Palace of Westminster is actually full of holes, leaks, faulty wiring and vermin, literally true, so I don't think you probably saw those bits on the tour. But I have a very grand office on the upper committee corridor, which is in the public part of the building. And when the Victorians designed this amazing building, they had a void at the top, a void at the bottom. I thought this was great air conditioning. The air conditioning never worked, but it created the biggest fire hazard of any royal palace anywhere probably in the world. So we have a lot of problems there. But actually, as well as the building, Parliament as an institution in this country is under huge pressure from the weight of events and the pace of change in our country, even without the dreaded B word, which has now been postponed 3 times, so I'm not even predicting. I have to say I represent an area of the country where 78% of people voted to remain in the European Union. So you guess, now being very political today, where I stand on that issue. But we live in a world of different engagement with the public. In that instance, the public were given a simple binary choice between the EU or not the EU. And then there's a sense that that can simply be resolved. And of course, as representatives of Democrats, we find that a bit harder to resolve than the simple yes no question. But in general, we live in a world of instant gratification, where people can get instant music, instant shopping, instant information, a smartphone in our pockets with more computer power than the Apollo missions. And Parliament, as we've seen perhaps over the last year and more, or 3 years really now, isn't it, by contrast remains plodding, deliberative, seemingly always behind the curve. And until very recently we had an analogue telephone exchange still in use. And when I was first elected we had a rifle range but no crash. So we're a bit slow and behind the times. But the role of Parliament's never been more important. We've got to steer our nation, and your parliaments have the same, to steer us into what is quite an unknown and scary future. So the issue of holding government to account is particularly important in my view. And that's why we're all here today, why you do your job and why I do mine. And I think accountability falls for me into 3 elements. The first is transparency. And that's one of the things we need from a national audit body and a public accounts committee. We need to shine that light into every dark corner of decision making so that we can see the decision making processes, the who, the what and why, laid bare. Secondly, we need redress. Not quite the core of what you do, but when people make decisions and waste public money, there needs to be some sort of sanction. When I've gone and spoken to people in other countries, I chair the Commonwealth Association of Public Accounts Committees. In Ghana, I tempt you with this idea. If a public servant has wasted money, they have to obviously appear before the committee, but they can be taken to court to pay the money back that they've wasted. if they want to challenge, sorry, they're asked to pay it up, and if they want to challenge it, we have to pay up half up front before they go to court. This is something that has tempted public accounts committees and audit bodies around the world, so I think I'm starting a trend, maybe Ghana is. But then the other thing is about impact, and that's the things that politicians, governments do, deliver, and make a difference, then we're all failing. And one of the real important roles that you have is to help, I think, steer government through challenges so that future projects don't fail. So I think we would agree that that's quite a challenge. And I think about how government has changed over the years. In the UK, a British citizen would have so many areas of life decided by ministers, from public health, public buildings, schools, the speed limit, where and what you can smoke. Cannabis is not legal here yet, but apparently that's being discussed. And then what time the pubs close, which is a great British institution, of course. And despite devolving things to Scotland, Wales, and well, Northern Ireland's a bit of a sore point at the moment, we're still a very centralised state, with government having huge powers. So the role of the Public Accounts Committee, we find ourselves and the National Audit Office being tempted to go quite deep down into different areas. I'm always being asked to kind of look at specific schools, and actually some schools are directly accountable to government. So that's a real challenge, I think, for national audit bodies. And it's very interesting, Gareth Davies was at an audit commission, which in those days when it existed was the body that looked at how local government spent its money. And here it is now, at the national audit body, having to grapple with the difficult tension. And so as we do on the committee, about how deep do we go, how realistically far down the line can we go. Now, the PAC is one of the oldest committees in the world. It's 158 years old, and it has since been joined in 1979 by other select committees in Parliament. And since 2010, the chairs of those committees are elected by MPs. So I was the second chair ever to be elected. My predecessor, Margaret Hodge, was the first woman, I was the second. And that has been a revelation. It has really put energy behind the select committee corridor. So I don't know what happens in your countries, but this is something we have found to be fantastic. It means that people enter the job with a very clear mission and definition about what they want to achieve, and are very quickly called out. We actually had a chair who had annoyed other members of the House of Commons because they'd been very freelance and done their own thing and not spoken for the committee, not been collaborative. And in a coup, they lost their job because someone else ran, and everyone rallied around the new chair. So it keeps us all on our toes, which I think is also very important. And many of the chairs, interestingly, are ex-ministers. It used to be the case that you'd be appointed a chair by the whips. It was a backbench career. And now we find that people are, in fact, we had the most extraordinary situation where the chair of an education minister became chair of the education committee within a couple of weeks of losing his job. He's still in that role now. And we had the chair of the Treasury Select Committee, had been the Treasury Minister, and became chair of the Treasury Select Committee, and left that job and went back to the cabinet. So she literally went minister, committee, back to minister, which is still quite unusual for us in the House of Commons, but becoming, I think, something that will happen more often. And we have obviously absolutely a critical role in making sure that we hold the government to account in a very public forum. But we couldn't do it without the 800 brains here at Buckingham Palace Road, led ably by Gareth and his directors. And you're talking about relevance today, and relevance is so important. When about a decade ago, the NEO would produce reports very slowly after an event, long time after the event of the issue had arisen and the project had failed, because, well, we tend to look at the ones that have gone wrong. So timeliness is a really critical thing for us as politicians. The National Audit Office now get out reports certainly around Brexit, and amazingly fast turnaround, sometimes a week after the final document seal is published, and then we can look at it a week or two later as a committee. Keeping that pace up and that relevance and timeliness has been really critical to making sure that we are, and the National Audit Office is actually influencing things in real time. Another thing, and Michael touched on this, is following through on recommendations. If we also, and I made my mission as chair, to make sure our reports I'm not sat on, but we get them out quickly into. It's been very rapid turnaround as I'm not going to be an MP tomorrow, because we had to turn things around very quickly the last week. But that timeliness is important too. But it's also important because those recommendations get less relevant as time goes on if we're not careful. So it's very important we follow them up. And one of the things that we've done is work again, working with the National Audit Office, I'll tell you a bit more about how we work together in a moment, is to make sure that we follow through on those recommendations. And we bring people into the committee room. So where a department has said they don't agree with a recommendation, or we don't think their answers have been very good, sometimes we'll write to them. Sometimes we will call them back into the committee room, and maybe only for 20 minutes or half an hour, and maybe at the beginning of a session on something else. We'll call those audit accounting officers in and ask them why they rejected it. When we started doing that, we had 3 occasions in the room where the recommendation response they'd given us, they overturned themselves. One of them was the then head of our tax authority, Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs. And I said, well, why did you go to the effort of signing off something that you then say, why did you then come to the room and agree with us? He said, well, I've been in the job 2 weeks, I've just signed it off as it came across my desk. And an insider in the Treasury said to me, it's good you're doing this. I'm going to put this in an English word that may not work in translation, but they used to write any old guff, or any old rubbish, in other words, and send it in a code. And actually, the more you look at those responses, and certainly going back, you can see ones where they say we agree with the committee, and then proceed to put in words that absolutely don't agree with the committee, and vice versa. Or sometimes the words just mean nothing when you actually read them. You can't quite work out what they're trying to say. They've got a very bland response. So following through is very important. And I think it's important that you can do that too, that you're, exactly as Michael says, the reports that audit bodies do are not academic documents to sit on a shelf and gather dust. They have a longevity. That's one of the joys of working with a body that's so thorough and detailed and full of analysis that a lot of those things are historic. And I get a lot of requests to discuss reports the National Audit Office and the Public Accounts Committee have done from several years back. Sometimes it's amazing in a week. I think I've dealt with something from 2 years ago, 4 years ago, something that's happening this week and next week. So where they are very relevant and on it, and they do have a shelf life, but that timeliness is really critical. And I think that brings to me the point about collaboration. We have an impatience as politicians to get things done. And you have a job to do a thorough piece of work. That thorough piece of work may not be happening as quickly as we would want it to, but we benefit from it being thorough. So we have to have that discussion about how fast things can move. And I've been very impressed and grateful that the National Audit Office has been rushing things through, particularly because we've had 2 short-term elections announced. So last Monday, I was busy trying to actually get my nomination as a candidate in my own seat. By Tuesday night, I was the candidate automatically because we had an election announced. And we had a hearing on Wednesday and have had to turn all of that around to be published today, because as of tomorrow, so you caught me just in time, I'm no longer a member of Parliament and I'm no longer the chair of the Public Accounts Committee. So the speed at which we work has had to be quite collaborative. But that collaboration goes beyond us suggesting ideas for reports, the National Audit Office trying to work with us to help timings that would hit the right moment in Parliament. Because again, if the National Audit Office comes up with a report that's fantastic, but it's after the government's made an important decision or an important announcement, it's not as useful. It might be interesting to commentators, so that's great. But if we're actually trying to change things, getting that timeliness is really important. So the parliamentary team here is also important in helping to bridge that need, if you like, across the two. But one of the things I introduced as chair was to work very, very closely with the National Audit Office in preparation for our hearings. So we pick which reports that we take. We meet twice a week when our parliament is sitting. We have 16 members of 4 political parties, and a peculiar anomaly. We have a Treasury Minister nominally on the committee, but they turn up once a year just to say, keep watching the money, and then they go. So we really have 15 active members. And I've introduced a system whereby members take it in turns to lead on a subject. So I'll have some members who are particularly interested in defence, and they will always be with me in a defence hearing. Others particularly interested in health, others who like to generalise. And that means they develop an expertise. I know as chair that I'm in the room with people who really know their stuff. They've done detailed preparation. And that detailed preparation starts a week or 10 days before. What doesn't start then, the bit we're putting first together, is in a room with my office, with the National Audit Office, with the members, the clerks of the House, so that we're actually working together. And that collaboration has, I think, delivered a much more effective way of working. I know as chair I've got good, well-briefed people in the room. The National Audit Office, and they can tell you this for themselves if they agree with me or not, then have an idea of what members are thinking. And we can sometimes, because we will take the report, but we want to sometimes stretch it in a particular direction because we know that's the area where government may be making a decision, or there's a new Secretary of State we want to influence. And because we do this cross-party, in that room, members of all parties, or sometimes just my party, or sometimes just the government party, but they will have different intelligence about what's going on in the House. Intelligence that's not just readily available to even the best auditors, we're talking of course to officials and departments. And so hopefully they are getting something from that political interaction about where we take things. And as a result of that, then we all go off and do our further preparation, and sometimes the National Audit Office will go and find out other bits of information for us. So we found that a very, really good way of working, and I'm really proud that the Canadians are now following what we do, the Ghanaians are doing a similar thing. So I'm hoping that we can spread the word, because obviously different audit committees work in different ways. And I think that is very helpful. I think interestingly in the UK, when we look at our reports, mostly what we look at is things that have gone wrong in terms of management and the lack of accountability. I think this is still a challenge. I think it's a challenge for audit bodies too. Because when you're talking to the accounting officer, certainly in the UK, that accounting officer very often won't have been in place for very long. There was one memorable case, and I remember the exact day because we had a terrible murder in Parliament on that day. It was the 22nd of March in 2017. And we had one accounting officer from the department who dealt with energy and climate change, and his two predecessors who were in the room to discuss a failed green project. And it was going to be, I think, a really interesting session because to have three senior people who had been responsible for this in the room at the same time is another thing we've been trying to do to make sure they're accountable. That's quite hard for you as an audit body. I don't know how. You can go back to the corporate history of an organisation, but one of the things that politicians quite like is if we can name somebody who's responsible, not naming and blaming just for its own sake, but making sure that people understand their accountability in the government department. That's something we try to do, and it's, I think, harder for you. So I'd be interested to know if any of you have found ways of delivering on that. But I thought it'd be good to just give you some examples of some of the things, some of the successes of the National Audit Office. Two very recent ones actually were a very good piece of work on fracking. Fracking has been discussed in the UK since around 2010. There's been a licensing arrangement in place with parameters, for example, on the size of earthquake tremors that would be allowed to happen in the event of fracking taking place. And the National Audit Office is the first body that has brought together all of the different points of view on that. In an instant success for Gareth and the team, the government has announced a moratorium on fracking within a week or so of the report coming out, which is in a way a shame, because we will still probably look at this, but it would have been quite nice to have been part of that discussion. But it actually threw up a lot of bad decision making in government. It's very difficult, going back to the accountability issue, to trace back who made decisions. There were decisions made but not thought through and connected to the wider policy area. So it's accountability for the individual, but also how it fits in with the rest of government. We've also seen we have so many IT projects in the UK. If you've got a successful one, tell us, it would be good to see one. But the one that was supposed to integrate the Department of Transport's human resources and financial services and also save £57 million ended up costing £81 million due to management ineptitude, which the committee at the time described as stupendous incompetence. We were obviously mild on that day. And then the famous issue, and this is going to be, Europe, whatever happens with Brexit, we'll throw this into sharp relief again. The IT scheme, which is designed to allocate subsidies to farms, was originally forecast to cost £155 million, but the programme ended up costing more than £215 million. And the scheme has delayed payments to farmers, and we received more penalties from the European Commission than Latvia, by quite some distance. And the problem was on this, it was actually quite extraordinary. Well, the National Audit Office did a great job of showing what was wrong in technical and management terms. In the hearing itself, we had the head of digital saying that the people who dealt with farms were a different group of people. They dressed differently to us, they behaved differently to us, and that's why they couldn't get And in that case, the people who did digital didn't realise that in large parts of the UK you can't get broadband if you're in a rural farm. So trying to do it all online is never going to work. There was a real example of the silos in government where they don't talk across. So that brings me to another point, and I think it's very important for national audit bodies. Something that the National Audit Office has really embraced in recent years is not just looking at a project in isolation, but looking at projects across the whole. We talk on the committee a lot about cost shunting, where if you take a saving in one area, it cuts across the other. I think we still, both the National Audit Office and the PAC, need to do more on how identifying that. But if we look at things across the whole, so we looked at housing across the piece, the National Audit Office has done some really good reports for us on that, looking at how education spending is, how they spend, a lot of issues around the financial sustainability of our whole healthcare system. Whole system-wide studies throw up some really interesting points, both on individual issues that we can winkle out of that, individual members of the committee can take up, but also to challenge the broader long-term thinking of our government's plural, because it will be over time for something like health and our country about how we address things. I want to move on to what I think are the real challenges for us all in dealing with governance, I think probably in all nations. I call them the 7 deadly sins. Silo mentality, I'll expand on these in a moment, short-termism, no institutional memory, capability, what I call faddism, which I'll explain in better English in a moment, and target setting or reorganisation. So, silo mentality, I mentioned cost shunting, that's where each department will say, well, I can save this much money. So a good example in the UK is where social services gets cut back because local government is facing a squeeze. So the care in the home for someone who's old or disabled is reduced, and that just pushes them into hospital. So there's a very expensive cost to the health service, although there's been a saving somewhere else. It's probably more costly for the health service. Another example would be cuts in mental health services. So who ends up picking up the pieces there? If someone's not got the support in the community, with a mental health problem, often it's the police that will pick that up. And I was on a visit to Devon and Cornwall where they said that they had no mental health beds for a teenager they found with a mental health problem. Or sometimes the furthest away Devon and Cornwall is in the southwest of England, and it's a very, very large area to cover. So even if you could find somewhere to put someone safe, it takes a couple of officers 2 hours to drive there and deal with the paperwork and drive back, so you've lost a lot of resource. Most people think the police are there to deal with crime, not to get somebody into effectively a safe place to stay while they are trying to secure the much needed healthcare. Short-termism, well, very live issue. I think it's a bit of a disease of politicians, and we're approaching an election in the UK. My dread is that we will see manifestos written quickly, thinking about winning on the 12th of December and not what will happen over the next 5 or 10 years. But one example would be the sale of housing to a private company 20 years ago with a number of strings attached, which has been a very bad deal for the taxpayer. But at the time, the minister who did it still defends it because it took them this difficult asset off government books. But we are now seeing the problems of that. They're once again coming through the Public Accounts Committee. And I'm privileged that on my committee I've got a long-standing Conservative member who was there when it happened the first time round, and he's here on the committee again when we're looking at it again. But short-termism is a challenge, and whatever you say as national audit bodies, there's always going to be the political tension, but we need to deal with today's problem and tomorrow's promise, as well as the long-term thoughtful future. The lack of institutional memory is a big problem, I think, and that's where really you have a big role to play, because you often are the next best thing to institutional memory. When I think of how fast in our system people move on, civil servants will typically become an accounting officer, stay for 3 or 4 years, they get a knighthood or a title, and then you can almost predict it. I may have been here my forbearer. But you can predict, if you work it out, you will see a pattern about the title comes and then they move on, because it's there is a cycle. So they're not usually there long enough to see the problems that they've created or be held accountable for them. One of the reasons we call people back, if they're still in the system when they've left, if they've actually retired, it's harder. But we say, you've got to come back. You're responsible for this problem 10 years ago and you're still in the system. Capability is a very big challenge. That's the skills in the civil service are grinding. I mean, I came on the committee now 8 years ago, and we were raising this issue then. And it was this very much a bit of the British system that you're a generalist. You've got a great brain, you take it on anything. And what we've been saying is you actually need people who can manage projects, who can understand budgets better, who can manage the delivery of a programme and recognise how to change things when things go wrong. And those skills and many others, IT skills are another case in point, are often still very much lacking in the civil service. Faddism, again, this is a bit of a political disease. What's flavour of the month at the moment? What's the thing that everyone is talking about? So sometimes it becomes a buzzword. The stakeholders when Tony Blair was in government, and that went out of fashion for a while. It was the big society when David Cameron got elected. And no one really knew what that meant because it never really got off the ground, partly because he had a coalition, but I don't think he quite knew what it meant. And the danger is you do something because it's the popular thing at the moment, and that's a really important role for you to call out, partly because you've got the institutional memory of what was the flavour of the month, the thing of the time, years before, but also you can look at the numbers about whether this actually delivers what it's set out to do. The fads are often short-term because people are just thinking about the headline, the moment, and not necessarily about the long-term. And then target setting and reorganisation can often end up with perverse incentives. So one recent example in my own area of London is breast cancer screening. In the UK, the system says that you're supposed to be having screened for breast cancer, if you're a woman, between the ages of 50 and 70 every 3 years. So there's been a problem meeting that 3-year target. So they've put extra resources into meeting the 3-year target so that you get it every 3 years. But in doing so, no one seems to have noticed what I have, so I'm pursuing it, but that someone who's 50 could wait till they're 53 to get their first screening. So there is a risk. There's a group of women who are at risk because they've got to wait 3 years, whereas normally they'd have gone through at a faster pace, but they're taking the resource out of that effectively and putting it somewhere else. And that's not what anyone has intended to do that. It is simply dealing with one problem, fighting a fire elsewhere has led to another problem along the line. Now, I call these the 7 deadly sins of procurement and project management, and these are things I think you will all recognise. And the failure on one is manageable. Things go wrong in big projects, we know that. But the real horror stories are the ones that are complex, multiple failures piling one upon another, compounding the errors. And I could give you many examples, but I think you might want to ask questions about things instead. And of course, no one's ever to blame. Failure is an orphan, and in our system, civil servants move on so fast that they're not there when it has gone wrong. And it's not that they are there, I want them to be named and blamed for their own sake. Sometimes people may have made catastrophic personal decisions, and that's fair enough if that needs to be pulled out. But more that they don't learn along the way. If you can almost not get away with that, makes it sound very pejorative, but if you're not there when it goes wrong, you're then reflecting on what they would have done differently. They do, but they're reflecting on what someone else should have done differently, and it's never quite their responsibility. And something's going to go wrong in every project. You can reduce some risks by better planning, something that you can help with in the work that you do. You can even plan for potential failure, and you can respond better when things go wrong. And I sometimes think that maybe, being hypercritical of my own committee, we pick on the biggest problems, things where things have gone very badly wrong, and are seen to just hammer departments because they've made a mistake. Actually, we need to also recognise when something has gone wrong, when there's been a good response to that. And one, we haven't yet seen the National Audit Office report on this, but the Thomas Cook, which is was a big travel agency you've heard of, because I'm sure they work across certainly the world, including Europe, and they went bust. And the minister had to decide over a weekend whether to commit £40 million to bail this out and get passengers back without any real knowledge about whether that would actually happen. Not, we had some sense, hunch, but didn't know. Actually, they did a pretty good job of getting over 2 weeks all the Brits back to Britain and safely home. So they did know, when they knew something was going to go wrong, they could do that. They were in a way lucky because there'd been another failure 2 years before of another travel agency in the UK, so they had a practice run. But one of the other things that I think is a big issue is optimism bias, which says, and we see this repeatedly is you battle on even when things are going wrong. And I think that is a challenge about how you and we say to people, because constantly, I can think of, we're looking at the court service in the UK, for instance, only a few weeks ago, and there's this great belief that if they keep doing what they're doing, it will all work out in the end. And some very good civil servants doing this work. I don't doubt that they're very committed, but they keep believing it's going to be all right, and we keep pointing out that it may not be. We've looked at customs declarations for post-Brexit. We kept saying we think this isn't going to quite work in the timescale you said. We've been right. We've looked at something where our emergency services communicate through a secure network. And we've had in the Home Office, our Home Affairs Department, in front of us 9 times, I think it is now. And each time we're saying, this doesn't seem to us to be working, and each time they go, no, it's going to be fine, because they've invested so much in it. And I think it was a challenge for us there. So we're saying it as politicians. Actually, the National Audit Office has been saying that repeatedly as a national audit body, and somehow they haven't learned that. So what's the gap, and what can we do, what can you do as national audit bodies to try and bridge that gap? And I think the other issue that I think is a concern for us all, which we can't resolve really, is time. Things change and you can't predict it. All you can predict is that you can't predict that things will change. So look at, for example, in 2010 in the UK, the then Chancellor of the Exchequer, our Finance Minister, decided to cap pension contributions. So we get tax relief in the UK when you contribute to your pension. So I'm a higher rate taxpayer as a richly paid MP. I get 40%. I pay my pension contributions before my 40% tax is taken off, so it's very valuable to me. He thought that we must stop this for the very richest. Quite a popular move, quite an interesting move from a Conservative Chancellor. But this has led now to a very big problem in our National Health Service, where publicly paid doctors are finding that they need to retire early because it's not worth their while paying into their pension because they no longer get tax relief when they hit a certain level of contribution. And so we're seeing a swathe of doctors retiring up to a decade earlier, and not just doctors, but it's now cutting into other areas of our public service. So he, perhaps I'm arguing that one, they could have projected that and predicted it, but no one would have thought, basically, that's effectively a tax on the rich, to put it in very simple terms, was going to lead to the loss of public servants a decade or so later. Or even sooner than a decade later, actually, so it took a long time. And then the other thing I think that is also a challenge for us all is technology. It moves at huge pace. When I was first elected, Twitter didn't exist. That was only 14 years ago. I have a landline telephone at home. There's 2 people who ring on it. One is my mother, and one is another friend who's in nearly 80, because no one else uses landline telephones. When I've spoken to young people in my constituency about the old days, and I say that television was black and white and there were 3 TV channels, they actually laugh raucously because they just don't believe it's true. And if you think that that's only in the last, when did colour television come in? But it's in the last 40 years or so. We've seen rapid change. And that, I had one example of this when I was a minister, so it's a decade ago now. I was responsible for identity cards, which in the UK was seen as quite controversial. I know it's not in the rest of Europe. And frankly, by the time I arrived in the department, the technology was already out of date. I think that's one of the challenges with that. People were already using fingerprints, and we were still talking about the ideas of biometrics. Universal credit, which has been a major change to our benefit system, hasn't really kind of understood. It was set up, it's a very, very challenging system to set up. You kind of end up sticking into tram lines because it's supposed to be able to adjust to people's needs, but really it's difficult when you're having 0 hours contracts, so you don't know how many hours you're going to work a week. You have jobs that change very often, flexible working, all of that makes it very difficult for the technology to deal with. So I wanted really to thank you again for coming. I'm very keen to have questions from you. I think it's important that we all up our game. I think it's important we don't come to conferences like this and not be challenged. And I think there's a lot we can learn in the UK from other countries, and I try to reach out internationally on these issues. I think the collective memory is a really important thing, and I think that's one of the most important elements that you have as audit bodies. You may not personally have it, but your institution has it in a much stronger way. So there's real opportunities there to share that and learn lessons, teach lessons really to government, and also When the world was of short-termism, you can be a voice that doesn't have to worry about tomorrow and next week and next month. You can think long-term. And I really urge you, in a world where politics is going a bit crazy, certainly here in the UK, and if we have a minister in place for a year, I think that's a long time. I mean, I just completely lose track of who's doing what in Parliament. And frankly, you don't even bother to lobby the minister now, because they're already there long enough half the time. You've got that long-term thinking. So prize that. And when politics gets sane again, maybe we'll listen to you.